So it's now my great pleasure to introduce a person with whom we collaborated very closely with at last year's COP28 in Dubai and her organization. Please welcome Tsipora Behrman, who is founder and steering committee chair of the Non-Fossil Fuel Proliferation Treaty. It's absolutely great to see you from Canada. Yes, correct.
Great to see you again.
Yeah, great. We've also got Tiana Jakevich. Is it close? Say it properly for me.
Jakisevich.
Okay, great. And she's Pacific Treaty champion, also with the treaty, and Thando Lukuku, coordinator, South African Climate Action Network.
Correct, yes.
Great.
Good to be with you.
Thank you very much, Nick. So I got 1 out of 3. Okay, fine. Thanks very much. So, for those that don't know yet, I mean, what is this treaty? Just briefly outline what it's about, what you're trying to achieve.
The goal of the Fossil Fuel Treaty is to create a companion agreement to the Paris Agreement, because for 30 years we've been talking about emissions and targets, but fossil fuel production has been continuing to grow. So right now we're on track to produce 110% more oil, gas and coal burn if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees, and that's by 2030. So the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty would be an agreement between countries that would be legally binding to stop the expansion of oil, gas and coal, to manage a wind down in a way that is just and fair and financed, and to fast track a transition to a just transition. So there are many countries now that are a part of the initiative, and the goal really is to build that block of nations over the next year, to begin negotiations, to start to create new trade agreements, new tax agreements, debt relief agreements to help countries stop the expansion of oil, gas and coal.
Right. And I mean, last year at COP28, in a sense, you were very successful in pushing for keeping the phase out, or the transition in a way, certainly, from fossil fuels in the final text. And also there were a lot of countries that also wanted that as well. What has happened in the last 12 months, and what do you think is happening here in Azerbaijan?
We were very successful last year in, literally for the first time in 30 years, getting the countries to acknowledge that we needed a phase out of fossil fuels. Since then, we were able to hold that line in New York at the Summit for the Future. And it wasn't easy. Many countries argued to have the reference to fossil fuels taken out. And let's be clear, fossil fuels have been invisible in climate policy and negotiations for a long time, probably because the fossil fuel industry wanted them to be invisible. But we were successful in New York and in Dubai, but we haven't really seen a roadmap yet for how that could happen. We haven't seen significant movement forward on the fossil fuel phase out. In fact, many countries in the world are expanding fossil fuel production right now. My own country, Canada, we're seeing more fracking, more oil development. Obviously, the US is the largest producer and expander of oil and gas in the world. But then we've also seen Australia just approve 3 new coal mines. So I think a lot of countries are still going in the wrong direction. And that's why we need 2 big things. We need finance commitments here at COP29, because for a lot of countries, what stands in the way is the ability to make the transition. There are countries just drilling for more oil in the heart of the Amazon just to feed their debt. So we need debt forgiveness, we need debt relief, we need grants instead of just loans, and we need the wealthy countries to act first and put money on the table. And so that needs to happen here at COP. But we also need a fossil fuel treaty, because we're not going to be able to see all of the mechanisms fast enough that will create a roadmap to get off fossil fuels just in the Paris Agreement. We need a new international cooperation and global governance, and that's why we also need a fossil fuel treaty.
So, Tiana, you're based in the Pacific, you're based in a beautiful island. Please inform the audience where that is.
Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Thank you. And you're at the forefront of efforts to phase out fossil fuels and revitalize indigenous knowledge to tackle global climate change and biodiversity losses. Tell us how you're doing this.
Yeah, well, first, Indigenous peoples globally make up 5% of the world's population, yet we protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so a lot of our efforts there look at the revitalisation of whakapapa, which is the genealogy we have to people and place, and the restoration of Indigenous knowledge systems to fight the polycrises that we face. In terms of fossil fuels, New Zealand at the moment is repealing our offshore oil and gas ban, among a whole host of other environmentally degrading pieces of legislation. So we work at the intersection of advocacy and action across Aotearoa and the Pacific, noting that we have a obligation to our relatives and whanaunga in the South Pacific to be the leader we purport to be, and also to our peoples at home who are constantly facing the devastating impacts of the climate crisis today.
Right. And Tando, you're in South Africa. You coordinate the South African Climate Action Network.
Yes.
What is your focus with this? And perhaps what is your focus here at COP?
Yeah, so as you know, Nick, South Africa recently received this 8.5 billion to transition away from fossil fuels. So our primary role at the moment is to support South Africa in their transition, specifically to advocate that they have more ambitious climate goals in so doing. So that's primary what our action is. Together with that, we then coordinate civil society responses around climate action within South African landscape. Specifically here at COP, though, our focus is on Article 6 and on NCQG. These are the two biggest things domestically which I think affect our country. And so that's what I've been tracking, what we've been tracking since we've been here.
Article 6 being carbon markets.
Carbon markets in the word, yes.
Are you pro or anti?
Anti.
Right.
Anti. However, it is one of those things that is very much it's happening, right?
Yeah.
So as opposed to being outside of the room, you try to get in the room and figure out how you might affect how things are being done, so that at least they're more responsive to people's needs and concerns on the ground. Yeah.
So they're a bit like Donald Trump, aren't they? I mean, it's happening, right? And we will have to face up to it. So what are we going to do about it, right? You're Canadian, you're not United States of America, but I think everybody obviously was a little bit shocked, and we've all heard a lot of rhetoric coming from the president-elect. But I get a sense in these corridors I've been going around, it's not like the last time he was elected, which was when the COP was held in Marrakesh in Morocco, and you couldn't hear a pin drop when the news came through. Here it seems whether they're just busy or like bees making a lot of noise, but not being as productive as bees in the rooms here. But there seems to be like, okay, well that's happened, but we need to move on, right? And it's a world of 190 plus countries, not just one country. Do you think that the attempt to reduce the fossil fuels, get off the fossil fuels, and also through the lens of the treaty, might be slowed by what has happened, I suppose, in the biggest economy?
Well, sure. I mean, I think it would be disingenuous to say that having a climate denier in office in the United States is not going to be a negative thing for climate change. It will be. It will slow some efforts down. However, I think part of the acceptance, or maybe even the lack of panic compared to the first time that Trump was elected, is that he was unable to stop the transition from to renewable energy. There is tremendous momentum on the move to renewable energy and electrification, and no one country, no one president, no one man is going to stop that. Renewable energy is now cheaper at scale than fossil fuels. This year we had double the investment globally in renewable energy than we did in fossil fuels. This is very historic. And we've seen, of course, that electric vehicles are just taking off, and electrification of transport is escalating dramatically around the world. He will not change that. However, the atmosphere doesn't really care how many solar panels we create. The atmosphere cares how many fossil fuel projects we stop. Because it's that oil, gas, and coal that's getting trapped in our atmosphere and smothering the earth and causing the dramatic rise in fires and floods and extreme weather. And so we also need to stop fossil fuel expansion. And certainly Trump is not going to do that, but neither did Biden. Biden did some great things, and the IRA legislation is an enormous step forward in climate policy in the U.S. And even if Trump tries to roll it back, a lot of what the IRA started will continue because of the markets and because of what we talked about before. But Biden dramatically expanded oil and gas production in the U.S. The U.S. is now the largest producer and is responsible for about 50% of the expansion of oil and gas on the planet. So even when you get so-called progressive climate leaders in office, many of them in the wealthy countries are still not showing the leadership we need on stopping fossil fuel expansion. And that's why I think it's so important to support the countries who are, like Colombia. President Petro in Dubai stood on the stage and announced that Colombia was endorsing and joining the bloc of nations supporting the fossil fuel treaty. And he said, look, I know that we're the 6th largest coal exporter in the world, and every day we make the problem worse. And we can't stop unless we have greater international cooperation and new rules of global governance to ensure a roadmap away from fossil fuels. And so there are 14 nation states who are now a part of this bloc, and more will be joining in the coming months. And I think given Trump in office, we should do everything we can to support those nation states who are standing up for a true science-based path to a just transition.
What are you both feeling, I mean, being here as perhaps younger delegates? I mean, do you get to talk to your governments? Do you get to actually communicate with them and tell them what you want? I mean, that you want some tough language on the phase out of fossil fuels. This can't just have been a one-shot in COP28. It has to actually grow from here, and there has to be action.
Yeah, despite the rhetoric that's happening at home and the complete erasure of Indigenous rights, the negotiators here have been really accommodating with the rights of Indigenous peoples and human rights language being advocated for within climate finance NCQG arrangements. Do we have work to do? Absolutely. Is New Zealand the leader? Absolutely not. But yeah, we are lucky in that regard.
Yeah, and we've also recognized that most African states identify with the fossil fuels being the problem, and with that, then it's what kind of alternatives are provided for them to be able to move away from it, because we all know we can't keep feeding the problem, ad nauseum. And so at COP, the beauty is that you get a chance to really put forth some good suggestions and proposals for how we might be able to get to where we need to get to fast, and that's to phase out fossil fuels.
There's this proposal that's been floating around this week from the former head of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Christina Figueres, one of the world's leading scientists, Johan Rockström, and Sandrine Dixon de Cleve, who's a good thinker as well, and lots of things, including with the EU and stuff like that, on reforming the COP. And one of the things is that it shouldn't be happening in a kind of fossil fuel major country, that's a kind of red line. I think we've all had mixed feelings about the last COP, and maybe perhaps this COP as well. In your view, would that be a good idea, or would that, mean that you're not there to kind of influence these countries? I mean, it's that kind of debate, isn't it? If you have the COP there, can you influence them? I mean, there was that scene at the end where the Saudi Arabians were yelling at the Dubai UAE president, saying, "You're not my brother," because he'd backed the phase out the phase out or transition language. What's your feeling about that? Is there a gut feeling? Is there an intellectual way of looking at it, or is it emotional? I don't know.
I think it's absolutely critical that there are reforms to the process, and I think probably no one knows what better reforms are needed than Christina Figueres. And look, one thing that's interesting about having the last couple of COPs in fossil fuel producing countries is that fossil fuels have been dragged center stage. In some ways, in the last 2 years, we're having a more honest conversation than we did in the 28 years prior in other COPs, where we didn't even talk about fossil fuels at all. So I'm glad we're having that conversation now. I do think they're right, though, that the presidency matters. and the presidency, whether or not that presidency is committed to actually moving forward, is essential for a COP. So I think the reforms they've proposed are really interesting. I would also like to see reforms that don't allow oil and gas and coal lobbyists to be here at all. Research came out yesterday that there are over 1,700 oil and gas and coal lobbyists here on the floors of COP. And, it's a bit like the fox watching the hen house. We didn't allow tobacco companies to be there when the frameworks and convention on tobacco was negotiated. It is, I think, absurd that they're at the table, and there's a lot of evidence now from Influence Map and others showing that these lobbyists being here weaken the outcomes of what countries are negotiating.
Right. It's a bit like the old days when you went back into the past with COPs. I can remember as a journalist covering the Kyoto Protocol, COP3 was it or something, in Kyoto in Japan, and there were tons of fossil fuel lobbyists in those days, all kind of slightly invisible, except Greenpeace worked out who they were and used to follow them around, which was quite interesting to watch. Your views on that. Do you think we should just take it out of the fossil fuel countries until they start showing definitely that they're prepared to decarbonize their business operations? Or
ideally, you wouldn't go to the place of the people that cause the harm to create the solution, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of ironic that we are here in a fossil fuel producing country that doesn't provide any direct finance to the people that are facing the very real and blunt impacts of the fossil fuel industry. So yes,
I must agree with Tatiana. We know where the problem is. We know that certain people have benefited from those problems, right?
Yeah.
But yet we choose to want to keep the conversation to push fossil fuels out in countries where the government is benefiting from it.
Yeah.
Seems counterintuitive somewhat.
Yeah.
How to do it, I think, is a difficult part, but I think doing it is probably the most important thing.
Yeah.
It's not just about who's here.
Uh-huh.
It's also about how our governments are holding those companies accountable, and who's paying.
Yeah.
Right now our governments are financing fossil fuel companies through subsidies. About $13 million a minute is going from governments to fossil fuel companies in fossil fuel subsidies. What if that money was actually going to the finance that is necessary to help countries adapt and to help countries transition? It would be an entirely new ball game. So we need to look at not just who's here and who's hosting. We need to look at money flows. We need to look at who's benefiting. These companies have made $2.8 billion of profit every day for the last 50 years. They benefit from continued expansion of fossil fuels, and so those incumbents absolutely should not be here. And maybe we should try something entirely new about whose presidency. Maybe we should have the Indigenous caucus be presidency for a year. Maybe then we'd get some really new thinking of how we should be approaching these issues, because what we need is international agreements that value life and living systems over profits to the oil companies.
Or also value the science, because that's just been so clear now for so many years that this pathway is a road to nowhere, right? And I still can't believe, when I have occasionally met people from the oil and gas industry, that they don't understand the science, because mainly they're not stupid, they just have a different priority. Some might say greedy. But they're smart, they know. But do they really think that they can just pull up the drawbridge on the Noah's Ark and sail off as a happy band of fossil fuel people without any impacts at all? It's going to impact everybody eventually.
But look, the fossil fuel companies know what's happening. I've met with the CEOs of most of the major oil companies in the world, and they know exactly what's happening, and they're not denying anymore that climate change is happening. But they want to be the last barrel sold, every single one of them. And so do many of our countries. And that's the problem, is that they're not going to regulate themselves. these companies are going to continue to try and produce as much as they can. And that's why governments need to regulate them. And that's why we need binding agreements to stopping the expansion of fossil fuels. And that's why I think we need a fossil fuel treaty and not just the Paris Agreement process.
Yeah. With the fossil fuel treaty, I mean, what do you engage with people in your communities about this idea of a treaty to manage down, fossil fuels and eventually manage them out? What is the reaction from your friends, your colleagues,
I come from the region that spearheaded the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty with 12, I think, Pacific nations currently. And so, yes, we're really lucky there in the South Pacific nations that have endorsed so far. There's been really clear alignment between what CSOs want and what governments want to phase out fossil fuels and climate change. In Aotearoa, we house the largest Pacific diaspora. And so we have a local campaign that's a conjoint effort between tangata whenua, Māori, and the South Pacific diaspora to phase out coal, oil and gas in Aotearoa and push for the call for a non-proliferation treaty.
Yeah, similar to South Africa, particularly in certain parts of the country, there is a strong dependence on coal specifically. But in those regions as well, they've seen the impact that burning of fossil fuels has had on their health, for instance. So engaging on them on pushing back on fossil fuels and the non-proliferation thereof makes sense because of how directly impacted they are by the burning of fossil fuels. And so the conversation becomes a fairly fluid and simple one to have, because it's not like you're talking about an abstract idea, right? You're talking about the direct benefit from stopping the burning of fossil fuels to their health, which kind of makes sense to anyone who's in those regions and other parts of the country as well.
And of course, there's a new game in town right now, which is a really positive development, which is the ability now with these new satellites like Methane Sat to actually see pretty clearly from space the amount of methane, which is a superheating gas, as you probably know. It doesn't stay in the atmosphere very long, but it's superheating, more heating than even CO2. And they can now see all these leaks coming out. The coal mines, for example, that was once, the official numbers that are reported back to the UNFCCC by nations with coal mines on their emissions, when you actually now compare what they report back to the UNFCCC versus what the satellites are seeing, it's a massive, massive difference. And, what's that song, Nowhere to Run, Nowhere to Hide? Nobody can deny anymore the sheer volume of greenhouse gases, including methane, coming out of the coal mines and the oil and gas industry as well. So, I get a feeling that this is changing a little bit the pressure on the fossil fuel industry, because I think before they were slightly wriggling out about how many emissions they were really putting up into the atmosphere. I think that's a positive development.
Absolutely. And of course very new. So we're only just starting to see the data come out for many regions, and I think it's really embarrassing. It's really embarrassing for the industry. It's embarrassing for the big countries who are doing the most production because they haven't been tracking it well enough. The industry has been lying about how much methane is escaping. And I think, though, we need to be pushing not just for these global methane pledges, but we need to be pushing for solid regulations and laws to stop the expansion, to stop the leaks, and to get companies to commit to plug the leaks of methane and to reduce methane.
On the show, we had, in the last few weeks, quite a few people talking about this. We had the European Union, who now have methane regulations, as you may be aware, and these regulations say if you are going to send any gas to the European Union, we're not going to take it from producers or whatever that are not at least plugging the leaks of their leaky oil and gas pipelines. And I said to the guy from the EU, well, what are the penalties? So, well, right now, not really any. But I can promise you that by 2027, 2029, if we don't see any change, then those will start coming in. It's a bit late, of course, as everything is late. But it's a good start to start saying, okay, we're going to put some trade rules on this in a sense. And Nigeria now has got regulations for this as well, because they know they won't be able to sell some of their gas if they don't comply. So it's kind of interesting that this is coming along too. Maybe that could be a supportive structure. Let's see, I don't know.
I think we're going to see a lot more trade rules and a lot more levies in the months to come.
Yeah.
As the it's almost like the battle lines are being drawn between
Yes.
countries who are acting and countries who are not.
Yeah.
And I think that's really critical.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to create incentives. Right?
Yeah.
That's I think the trueness of it. We have to create incentive to move away from what we know is the problem.
Yeah.
And I think such kind of measures do help things to move along a little bit faster.
Yeah.
And I think, as you've said, Zipporah, we'll start to probably see it happening in a lot more parts of the country. I mean, the US also got the IRA, and the
They have some
Japanese
regulations
has
as well
also won
because
something.
they are a producer and an exporter, and the EU is a importer. So there is, but anyway, we'll see if those regulations stay. But the EU seems to be pretty clear about it, and I hope they can hold the line, because actually, when you look at a map of the world and you look at emissions, it seems like the EU is the only one right now that's actually moving in the right direction, right? I mean, it's if the EU goes, it's going to get even more messy, right? So, well, look, we could chat about this for hours, but we know there are important things that you all have to do, and it's Saturday. So I would like to say thank you for being with us, and thank you for sparing the time. Sorry the show was a bit delayed, but it involved a foot, a high heel, and a plug socket. And with that, we will say goodbye and thank you very much indeed. Let's move on.
And we're continuing the wrap-up session. We have guests in the studio, but first, Nick, we're going to Stockholm, right?
I believe we are going to go to Stockholm. We're going to our dear friends David and Christina in Stockholm. And so, any thoughts about today's shows? Please.
Of course. Hi, Nick and Katarina. Many thoughts about today's show. It was very interesting. And I especially liked the China session, where they stated that the climate crisis is the largest market failure ever, which we know. And we talk about scaling solutions exponentially, which is difficult to understand. So then I think it was really rewarding to see that there are solutions ready to scale exponentially in China. However, to really do that, they need capital from the rest of the world. So we're all in this together. That was my takeout today. David, what was yours?
Well, I would like to bring back globalization, perhaps, following on what you're referencing, Christina. When I was a young man in my 20s a while ago, was sort of a hot topic. But we were talking about like free trade and worker exploitation and free-flowing capital that was creating financial crisis and so on. And that's not the globalization I'm talking about. I'm talking about international collaboration to really push the global climate transition that we need. Maybe a global wealth tax, or maybe not a nationalization of oil companies. Maybe the UN should take them over instead and wind them down. And of course, this relates also to creating global markets, global carbon markets, and other ways of sharing innovation and working together as a global community. So bring that back, please, because as you know, we're not heading in that direction right now.
Can I ask one thing? I mean, I must say, I'd never ever thought, and I didn't really even know what biogas was until I actually listened to that lady. And I was really a bit hazy about it before this show, but I didn't realize that just literally loads and loads and loads of methane coming out of all kinds of waste, from organic waste and animal dung and hay in farms and blah, blah, blah. But actually a huge amount of methane can be produced from the anaerobic, the bacterial, breakdown of this. You collect it and you've got like a little generator on your farm or your community, or something really quite big for a community if you want a big biogas station. It's really good.
I throw all my eggs and bananas, peels and whatever that's organic. I throw them in a separate bin and give it to the local municipality, and they produce biogas from it.
Really?
So that's one methane adaptation that we could share around the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's legally mandated now in all over Sweden, and it's coming in all over Europe too. So that's a good source of collecting the methane.
Yep.
So thank you, Christina, and thank you, David. And now next to me here in the studio is Anita Soina. You're a climate change advocate and also Green Party politician from Kenya. And wonderful to have you with us. We try to have you every wrap up here in the session. So Anita, turning to you first, what is your impression of this day at the COP? You network a lot, you walk around, you meet a lot of people.
Yes, so first of all, I had a chance to interact with youth champions, UN youth champions, for when we had a meet and greet for different UN youth champions, and where young people were sharing what they do back at home. And we were at the water pavilion discussing the role of young people in advocating for WASH and why it is important. I also had a chance to go to the Green Zone, and I went to the IPU meeting, and I think my biggest takeaway was the parliamentarians from the Global South admitting that as a Global South we don't have to come to COP to just say that what we expect from the Global North in terms of finances, but also what are we able to allocate locally, because most of the times we ignore that, and the resources that we collect back at home, we don't allocate them. So that was one of the biggest discussion, and it was great to see parliamentarians also talk about accountability of the finances as well, and why they are at COP. And parliaments make COP count, and so it's great to see them here talk about legislation, and also to make sure that when we go back home, we have the policies are tailored to our different needs in our countries, and it's not just we don't all borrow from a specific policy, for example, that maybe could not be Afrocentric, for example. And I also went for a press conference by the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and they shared why it should be just, transition should be just. And an example was given from Kibera in Nairobi, where people use plastic. They ban plastic in place of charcoal to cook, for example, because charcoal has become rare, and also trees are over. We don't have a lot of trees for charcoal itself, and the fact that they are not allowed to cut trees for charcoal, the few trees that we have for charcoal. But then the issue is when we ask them to transition, for example, to other alternatives, are they cheaper for them? Are they affordable for them? And if not, they will continue to opt for example, plastic that they just have to pick from the trash place. And so those are some of the things that they talked about, that they are going to make sure that the innovations and the solutions that are going to come are also at least affordable for the low-income households.
Thank you, Anita. This is, of course, a crucial topic. So, Ingmar, you've been here all day as usual, and what are your main takeaways from this day?
That it's nice to have power when you do a broadcast. We had a power
we had a power outage. Yeah, we did. Twice, actually.
And we actually discussed it, you and me, on the way here. And that is here in Baku, they're still quite heavily dependent on fossil fuel to produce electric. Hopefully, I mean, they have a transition plan, and hopefully that can be speed up even further. But in countries like Sweden, that you actually have almost 100% fossil-free electricity, every time you're doing like a big TV broadcast or big event, there is always relying on diesel generators. And they're just having them as backup.
Didn't work today.
Didn't work today. The thing with those diesel generators, in order for them to work, they need to be running all the time, even if you don't use the energy. There's a brilliant solution to this. We have it in most modern cars. It's called battery.
Yeah.
So I regret that we didn't bring the battery to power our broadcast studio here. But I think that helped us prove the point that we need to stop using those diesel generators. Even if you're a country that are relying on fossil fuel for electricity production, it's not good to have the diesel fumes next to where you are living. So regardless, wherever you are in the world, stop using those DC generators and use the batteries instead.
Thank you, Ingmar.
That was a different learning from today.
Have a biogas little power plant, yeah.
Yeah, but maybe not like far away.
Not here, no.
So Nick, anything you want to add? Your takeaways before
No, not really. I mean, it was good to hear from the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty right now, and two people, one from New Zealand. I can't actually pronounce the Maori name very well, for New Zealand and South Africa. I mean, two young people, very active indeed. I wonder where that treaty goes next, given the atmosphere in the world. I hope it goes forward, right? And I hope those 130 plus countries in COP28 last year step up at this COP and say again, I'm sorry guys, we're not slowing down on this. We need to go even further with the fossil fuel transition out. So I'm hoping at the end of this COP, the pedal won't be off, on that particular issue when it was a bit of a win in COP28.
So my big takeaway from today was the talk that I had with two youth activists that were really showing the power of the transition that comes and the power that comes from the youth. And one of the statements there was really gave me goosebumps in terms of he spoke straight into the camera and said, if the world leaders don't step up, they need to step aside because we're coming. Yeah. And it was just really, really lovely to hear that, just to feel that power in the room. Speaking of power, we had outage and we need to cut this wrap up fairly short, but we do have two more guests coming up, so let's move on. So, many people here at the climate conference in Baku had to use aviation. I'd say the vast majority flew into this climate meeting, as many climate meetings. But we have two people here in the studio that did not. They used bicycles to get here. And you probably bumped into them if you were here during the day, wearing bicycle helmets and bicycle outfits. Some of you have seen them. So it's a great delight to have you with us here and explain how you did this. And Jolene Sherrill, the hashtag COP29 bike ride is your hashtag. Wonderful to have you. And also Guillaume Autrage, COP29 bike ride. So please tell us, why are you doing this? And just go ahead, Guillaume.
All right. Yes. Well, we're doing this because we want to help on transport mitigation. We want to advocate for that. Transport is about 23% of our carbon emissions, and it's thus something important. But it's, of course, like anything, it has to be financed when you want to do mitigation, and also it takes time. So we believe cycling, or it's not we believe, I can give more facts about that, but cycling is a very efficient way to quickly reduce our carbon emission in the transport sector in a very cost-effective manner. And since, as everyone knows, financing is a big topic at this conference,
it is indeed.
It's important to find solutions to do so. So we are here because of that.
So the cycling here, how long did it take, Jolene? Please tell us.
The ride took about 4 to 5 months. We started in June
and from Paris because of the famous Paris Agreement, and from there many people from Europe and also from the USA joined the ride for parts of it, and now we're here. So it took about 4.5 months, I think.
And tell us about the route. I mean, what direction did you take? I mean, which cities did you pass? And just in short.
Talking about countries, it was France, Germany, Austria, Croatia, a bit of Serbia, Bulgaria, a bit of Greece, Turkey, because it's a long country.
going east, yeah.
And then Georgia, and finally Azerbaijan. So that was wonderful.
That is terrific. So some countries, we have some strong track records from some countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, where people have, for many years have been commuting with bicycles. I think in Copenhagen it's 40% of the daily trips that are made by.
Indeed, yes. Indeed, yes.
It is 40%. And I'm from across the sound from Malmö. We're up at roughly 32%, so we're quite good too. So how can we make other countries follow suit? Guillaume or Julien?
Yeah. So, in fact, we are bringing into this COP 10 proposals that we think are an excellent summary of what should be implemented by countries or cities in order to progress on their cycling. You were talking about what is called, in fact, what you're referring to is called the modal share. That's the share of biking in a given city or other places. And in fact, there's been a study made recently by the PATH, which is the Partnership for Active Travel and Health, that shows if our modal share for 3 activities, the biking, the cycling, the biking, the walking, and the public transport, reaches 80% of our travel modes, then we can actually reduce the carbon emission by 50%. So those modes of travel are very important. And now if you drill down, if you look at what you need as a city, for instance, to achieve those numbers, there's something which is pretty cultural, which is the walking, which is, can be, for instance, at 50%. There's not much you can do about walking. Public transport is another item, but it costs money and it's actually quite lengthy before you can achieve result in public transport. However, biking, going from 1%, 2% of biking modal share to more than 10% is something that can be achieved in a matter of, let's say, 4 to 5 years. So it's within reach. So what we're saying is let's have all cities worldwide reach 10% and it will make a big difference.
Thank you, Guillaume. Julien, would you like to add before we need to conclude?
Yes, but we see that in many cities there are a lot of people already active on this. So there's a lot of communities empowering people. So we see that cycling is good for the climate, but it's also connecting people and makes it really inclusive. So there's bicycle kitchens in several cities where enthusiastic volunteers teach people how to ride the bike and how to repair them themselves. And a lot of women are active on this topic as well. So it really empowers women and improves inclusivity. So biking is really important for both climate and the people, and that's what we see along the whole trip. So it connects.
And I have to say, I live in Berlin and I don't have a car, so I just have my bicycle, my walking, and my public transport. So that makes me a model citizen, hopefully in your eyes.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
And biking is my favorite mode of transportation too. So we're very happy that you are doing this, and keep pedaling because we need you.
We will.
Yes. Maybe we can conclude by our motto, as we say quite often, or we say that we ride slower so they change faster.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, thank you so much. Let's move on. Before we conclude this broadcast, we're moving on to watch a fantastic speech, and it was given yesterday by Al Gore here in the plenary, one of the plenary rooms, and we were able to get the tape, and we will air it now. And it was very much appreciated in the room. Lots of applause, and it's very empowering. So please enjoy, stay, watch this, and share it, because this is going to make you become even more active in this fight. Thank you very much for this day, and thank you for watching. We Don't Have Time.